Mark Littlewood is Director of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Mark, welcome. Is this just a game that they're playing then, make us think it's going to be really, really bad and then just say, well, it's only 25%, so it doesn't feel quite so painful?
Well, there's some politics in it, clearly. I mean, after the election, we've seen the coalition government get more and more serious about spending cuts. But until this morning, nobody had even conceived as 40% as a figure that any department should be looking at. So I'm sure there is some politics in it. I like the rhetoric of this. We've got to get public spending under control. It's gone completely out of control. More than 50% of the British economy is spent in the public sector. That's madness.
But to talk about 40% cuts, even if they're never actually implemented, if they're being asked to look where they could make those cuts, isn't it fantastical? Who could possibly achieve that?
Well, no, I actually think that they should be a bit more radical. One of the worries I've got about the way they're approaching this is to ask everybody to make savings. It's a sort of salami slicing.
They should actually, saying it's not salami slicing.
They should be looking at closing down whole government departments.
Such as?
Well, such as the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. That should be cutting its budget by considerably more than 40%. If there's any residual function that the DCMS needs to do, it should be wrapped up in the Home Office. Business, innovation and skills. Business, innovation and skills, three things that the government are absolutely terrible at. If there's any residual function in biz, it should be wrapped up into the Treasury.
Well, maybe they need a department so they can get better at it. But if you want to go that far, I mean, just reduce government down to the bare basics and decide that the government shouldn't be involved in anything. But then we're left with a situation where vulnerable people aren't protected, people who are underprivileged never get any help towards improving their lot. Where do you draw the line?
Well, the best way of approaching this, I think, is what Canada did in the 1990s. Rather than sending missives and memos round saying, can you make some savings here, can you make some savings there, however grand, they started with a blank sheet of paper. They said, what do we want the public sector to do? And they built from there. If you weren't on that list after they've considered it, you were closed down altogether. That would actually be a better way of us looking at it. What do we want our government to do? What do we want our taxpayers' money to go on? The ring fencing of the NHS and international development becomes a complete farce, obviously, in these sort of circumstances. We should start from the base up and then work out what it's going to cost and how we're going to organise it.
The government will probably say that they are trying to do something akin to that Canadian example, but how much of these cuts are really about the deficit and how much is about ideology?
I don't think it is particularly ideological. More's the pity. I'm ideologically committed to a much smaller state sector. I think it is a recognition that the deficit is wildly out of control. And they are definitely pushing the boat further out than they need to on this memo from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, from Danny Alexander. They're pushing out more than they need to. I'd be very surprised if when any of the cuts come it's 40%. But I think it is a recognition that spending's got out of control, it needs to be brought under control, and at least they're sending out the right signals in stark contrast to the previous administration.
But isn't the thinking though from many economists that if you cut back on too much public sector spending, you will affect the very recovery that we're all trying to get out of?
Some economists, mainly left-wing economists, will say this. I think it's a misnomer. We've got to understand it's a zero-sum game. The more you want to spend in the public sector, the more you've got to take from the private sector. And it's the private sector that will actually be the engine that drives economic growth and gets jobs back and starts to find more employment for getting us out of this recovery. It's the private sector will do that. The idea you're taking money out of the economy if you cut back on the public sector is nonsense. You're simply leaving the money in the private sector, and that's the best hope for building on the fragile economic recovery that we've seen to date.
Mark Littlewood from the Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you.